Hello, everyone. This is Tony Lowe with the TVC podcast. Now, today I'm going to talk about something which I'm going to call Catholic moral training. But I want to give a bit of explanation to what this topic is before I really get into it, because I don't think it's actually going to take that long. So let me explain how I'm approaching this. Prayer, arguably, is what we're here to do. Okay. Some people might say it's dangerous to kind of reduce life to a single thing, but I think in many ways you can. The other funny thing is that single thing is actually many things, right? So I could say that the one and only thing we should do in our lives is love and serve God. Yeah. I could also say that the one and only thing we should do in this life is pray. But I could also say the one and only thing we should do in this life is become saints. And they're all actually the same thing, because you become a saint by loving and serving God with the fullness of your devotion. And you do that by praying, because praying, really what praying is it's putting not only your words, but your thoughts and your intentions in line with the presence and the will of God, right? That's why verbal prayer is only one form of doing that, because when we speak our prayers, we're obviously putting our thoughts and our words in line with God and trying to place ourselves in His presence. But there are other ways to do it, right? You can simply, for example, lift your heart to God and intend for Him to be with you and hear you. And also, if you intend for the actions that you perform throughout the day to serve Him, then those actions then also become a form of prayer as well. So praying isn't just saying your rosary, though that is an important part of it. So prayer really is what we're here for, because that is what puts us in God's presence, and all good things come from Him. And what we're doing is we're basically practicing communing with Him, right? Because that's really what He's setting us up to do for the rest of eternity. Why would He want anything else? He is goodness itself, and if He wants what's best for us, what He wants for us is Him, actually. And so what He wants is for us to get close to Him, to form that relationship with Him, to mold our lives into His will, because they, by definition, cannot be anything better. So we're here to pray, basically. So we know that prayer is important, but the other thing that I've learned from what little study I've done is that prayer, not all prayers are equal. And you can become better at it, right? So you get this example from, some of the contemplatives I've read, such as Saint John, would it be of the Cross, who wrote The Dark Night of the Soul? It's either of the Cross or Chrysostom, unless they're the same. My apologies. But anyway, St. John and St. Teresa of Avila, who talk about their kind of burgeoning struggles with prayer, but then how they increased in their devotion and their dedication to it. And it makes sense, right? Because one of the things that God is teaching us in life is humility. And I think one of the ways He does that is by not just giving us our perfections on a plate. I think He limits our perfections and makes us work for them, so that I think the reasons are twofold. Firstly, so that we don't start off with such a capacity or such an ability that it fuels our hubris. And secondly, so that it teaches us things like patience and perseverance and commitment, so that we can develop those perfections and qualities. And so we see this in all other skills in life. Like if I want to become stronger at the gym, I have to lift more weight and put my time and dedication into that. I have to make sacrifices for that, like my time and my comfort. And if I want to develop a skill, like I want to learn how to chop wood, then I have to put time and commitment into that. And obviously I develop my skill of doing those things, the more commitment I put into it. And from what I understand, the same is true for prayer. But here's the thing. If I want to ask, Have I improved at lifting weights? Well, I can measure that, can't I? Because if on month 1 I was only able to lift 20 kilograms, but by month 10 I'm able to lift 200, then there's a visible objective measure for the improvement of that skill, right? If I can only chop 1 piece of wood in an hour on the first day, but I can now chop 100, then I've made another objective, visible, measurable form of improvement with my skill. And so the question that kind of irked me is, well, if prayer is a skill that we can develop, if there's better and worse ways to pray, if we can progress, that's the point, if we can progress in our ability to pray, which is certainly the case, then what's the measure there, right? Now, here's another factor that makes this complicated. Saint Teresa, for example, really emphasized that you can't measure the efficacy of prayer by how good it makes you feel. So there's this thing that the saints and the church refer to as consolations. And the idea of a consolation is that when you're praying, God might make you feel good. It might feel really pleasant. He might give you this sense of what they call sweetness when you're praying, where you kind of feel that rapture and comfort of being in his presence. But the thing is, he doesn't, first of all, he doesn't give that to all people equally, but also he doesn't give it even to the saints in some cases. It's not just like the moment you start praying, he starts dishing out condolences. The idea is that it's down to him to give those when he sees fit. And sometimes he keeps them away from people whilst they're developing. There's reasons for that, right? So I remember, was it St. Francis de Sales talking about how one of the reasons why he might do that is because otherwise we might start praying for the condolences instead of for the value of the prayer itself, right? So if I go and sit down and pray my rosary and on the Monday it's making me feel a state of bliss, then if I go to pray that rosary again on the Tuesday, but I'm doing it in pursuit of that bliss, then who am I praying for? Am I praying for God or am I praying for my own pleasure? Right, so that gives you an idea of what he might withhold them. He might also withhold them, even if we don't have that thought in mind, he might withhold them to see, okay, my children are learning to speak to me. They're learning to love me. Will they continue in that pursuit and that love and that dedication, even if it's painful for them, right? I don't know, Saint Teresa, for example, talked about how prayer, some parts of her prayer life could be very, very uncomfortable. Yet she knew with her sense and her conscience that doesn't matter. You keep praying anyway. And I think, like the test of Job, that's a small example of God, a reasonable reason why God would do that. And say, would you remain faithful to me even if this pleasure wasn't there? Would you suffer for me, I suppose, in that case, and suffer even in prayer? So the takeaway there is that condolences are not a measure of how good you are at prayer, because condolences can be given to beginners and saints alike, and they can also be withheld from both beginners and saints. So you don't measure how good your prayers are by how they make you feel. Yeah, that's the point. You don't measure how effective your prayer is by how it makes you feel. And so that bugged me. I thought, okay, so you can't use that measure. Because obviously, when I'm lifting weight, it's like, well, have I become stronger? Well, is the 20 kilograms easier to lift now than it was before? And that would be my measure. Is the wood easier to chop now than it was before? That would be my measure. But that doesn't apply to prayer. The question isn't, is prayer easier now than it was before? Because it's like, well, no, because God might make it more difficult. Right? So if that's the case, is there a measure? Because if I'm not progressing, say for example, I'm going to the gym on a regular basis and it's not getting easier for me to lift heavier weight, then when I'm not making progress, then I know that I need to change something, or I might need to rethink of my approach, or I might need to improve in some other way. So that's why you need some external measure to make sure that you're actually doing things properly and improving and proceeding, right? So when we tie it back to prayer, well, if prayer is even more important, infinitely more important than lifting weights or learning a skill or learning to chop wood, then we have to consider if there's some measure there as well. So that explains the whole thought process. So what I did is I took that question to a priest and asked him exactly that, with all of the reasons that I've just explained to you. And his answer was very interesting. He said, "You're very right. You can't use condolences to measure progress, but progress can be made." And his answer was, "You know that you've improved in the life of prayer if it becomes easier for you to be virtuous." I thought that was a very interesting answer. In one sense, it would apply to prayer itself, right? It's not, is the actual time of being in prayer more or less comfortable? But one of the things would be like, if you know that you should pray more, do you simply do it more often, right? So maybe if you're beginning, your conscience tells you, you should pray the rosary today, and you say, I'm not going to. But maybe as time progresses, your conscience tells you you should pray the rosary, and your response is, of course I'm going to, even if it's not going to feel very nice, right? So it could make the actual, even if the prayer itself is very uncomfortable, the actual desire or willingness to do it might become lighter, right? But then I think he was also explaining this to say, no, the measure is how it affects the rest of your moral life as well. Do you find it easier to be patient with people or with the situation you're in, as you keep on praying and as you keep lifting your heart and mind to God? And in fact, also as you keep asking him to help you, right? Because that really should be a big part of prayer. Don't think you're being selfish when you ask God for good and moral things, because not only does he want to give those to you, but you should ask him for them, right? The best version of yourself is the most virtuous version, and the version of yourself most pleasing to God is the most virtuous version. And so you're actually, in a sense, I suppose, weirdly, like kind of doing him a favor by becoming more virtuous, because it's just really a win-win situation. So if you should ask God for things like hope and charity and faith and patience and all this kind of stuff. And the question would be like, as you're praying more and you're trying to put your mind and your heart and your presence in communion with God, that would necessarily entail virtue, right? Because to live by God's will is to live virtuously. And so if prayer is about living in communion with God's will, consistently with God's will, then really prayer is all about virtue. Yeah, really. And again, it's that another facet of like, well, if we were going to say life is about one thing, you could say, well, the whole meaning of life is to be virtuous then, but that's all part of loving and serving God. So that can be a measure of how effective your prayer is being. Yeah. Now, so for example, if, like I said, if you become more patient, become more courageous, become more charitable, become more humble, these can all be signs that something is working. And conversely, if you keep praying for something like patience, but you find that 6 months later you're just as irascible as you were 6 months before, then you might stop and think, okay, but how am I praying? And in what manner, right? When you pray to God for patience, there could be a couple of things going on there, right? Like, do you actually, for example, if you ask him to make you patient, do you actually mean it when you ask? Because he's going to know, right? He might know even if you're not being honest with yourself. You might tell yourself you want to be patient, but you might actually be lying to yourself. Or so that's something to keep in mind. When you do pray for patience, right? So maybe you, for example, say, dear Lord, make me patient, and I offer this decade of the rosary for the virtue of patience. Then do you actually then pray that decade? Do you actually give that prayer with your attention, right? So do you just say that mechanically and then rattle off the words as if you're just speaking to the air, or you're playing around within your own head? Or do you actually give him your focus and your attention whilst you're praying, right? Because if nothing is changing at all in your character, then that might, there might be an indication that you're not praying in the way that you should do. Aside from that, any specific kind of reflection or advice, it always feels strange because I'm not I'm not a spiritual teacher. Right? This is why I took this question to a priest, because I know that he can instruct and has much more wisdom on these things than I do. And whenever I've delved into these topics before, I always say the first thing you should do is speak to a spiritual instructor. Find a good Sedevacantist or Sedepravationist priest who knows about these matters and who can instruct you properly. Or, failing that, go and look for the teaching and the example of the saints if you want to kind of pursue this kind of stuff. But very interesting thing to think about, right? We can pray and we can do it more or less effectively, properly, and there are means and ways to tell whether we're doing that if we're being properly honest with ourselves. So just a reflection to think about moving forward, if any of you do want to pray and know the value that has. So that's all for this one today. Go to my website, tonyvclow.com, for main links to everything else. www.thetvcacademy.com for the academy, and you can find me on YouTube as well. So God bless you. Thank you all for your time.